Michael Carter stood in the sterile billing office of St. Catherine's Hospital, his calloused hands trembling, tears carving paths down his weathered face as he begged the coordinator for something impossible. He would work for free, he pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. He would clean floors, scrub toilets, anything for years if they would just give his 7-year-old son the medicine that could save his life. The drug was called Neuragen, and it cost $280,000 for a full treatment course. What Michael did not tell them, what he could not bear to say aloud, was that 12 years ago, in a laboratory across the ocean, he had invented that very drug, the miracle cure now held hostage by a price tag he could never pay. This is the story of how the man who gave the world hope found himself with none left for his own child. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of a cramped apartment on the eastern edge of the city, touching the worn furniture and faded photographs that decorated the modest space Michael Carter and his son called home. Michael moved quietly through the small kitchen, his movements practiced and gentle despite the bone-deep exhaustion that pressed against his shoulders like a heavy coat he could never remove. He had worked the night shift again, 10 hours scrubbing floors and emptying waste bins at the research facility downtown. But his shift ended at 6, and Tommy woke at 7, which meant Michael had exactly 1 hour to transform himself from the exhausted janitor into the father his son deserved to see each morning. He cracked eggs into a bowl, whisked them with the kind of care most people reserved for precious things, and poured them into the skillet where they hissed and bubbled into golden clouds. The smell filled their tiny home. Tommy emerged from the bedroom they shared, his dark hair sticking up in every direction, his eyes still heavy with sleep but brightening the moment he saw his father. "Good morning, buddy," Michael said, and his voice held nothing but warmth, not a trace of the fatigue that made his bones ache. Tommy climbed onto the wobbly kitchen chair and immediately launched into questions about why eggs turned solid when you heated them, and whether that was a chemical reaction or something else entirely. Michael answered each question with genuine enthusiasm, explaining protein bonds and heat transfer in ways a 7-year-old could understand. Watching his son's face light up with understanding, this was what he lived for. These moments before school when Tommy's brilliant, curious mind danced from one question to the next, when Michael could glimpse the scientist his son might become one day. When the sacrifice of his own abandoned career felt worthwhile. Sarah would have loved to see this, Michael thought, as he always did during these morning rituals. She had died bringing Tommy into the world, had held Michael's hand, and made him promise to give their son everything, to fill him with wonder and knowledge and love. Michael had kept that promise every single day for 7 years. He served Tommy his eggs and toast, poured orange juice into a plastic cup with cartoon characters fading from too many washes, and sat across from his son, hiding his exhaustion behind a smile that was entirely genuine because Tommy made everything worth it. Everything. The phone call came at 2:15 in the afternoon, while Michael was sleeping after his shift, trying to steal a few hours of rest before picking Tommy up from school. The school nurse's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Your son collapsed during recess, Mr. Carter. We have called an ambulance. He is breathing but unresponsive." Michael's world tilted sideways. He ran 6 blocks to the school because he had sold his car 3 months ago to cover their rent. His heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with terror. He arrived as the paramedics were loading Tommy into the ambulance, his son's small body strapped to a gurney that seemed far too large, his face pale as moonlight, his eyes closed. Michael climbed in beside him, taking Tommy's small hand in both of his own, feeling how fragile those fingers were, how cold. The ambulance screamed through traffic, sirens wailing, and Michael whispered into his son's ear that Daddy was here, that everything would be all right, that Tommy needed to hold on. The emergency room was chaos and fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant that burned Michael's nose. Nurses swarmed around Tommy, attaching monitors that beeped urgent rhythms, inserting an intravenous line into his thin arm, shouting medical terminology that Michael only half understood. A doctor appeared, young and serious, asking rapid-fire questions about Tommy's medical history, about symptoms Michael might have missed, about family conditions. Michael answered everything through the fog of fear, his voice steady even though his hands shook, his composure intact even though his heart was shattering. They took Tommy for tests, imaging, blood work, neurological assessments. Michael sat in a chair outside the examination room, his head in his hands, and waited. Minutes stretched into hours. Doctors passed by, talking in low voices, their faces grave. Michael watched them through the glass, saw them looking at screens and shaking their heads, saw concern deepen into something worse. He returned to Tommy's bedside when they allowed it, took his son's hand again, and made a promise he did not know if he could keep. "You are going to be fine, buddy," Michael whispered, his thumb stroking Tommy's knuckles. "Daddy promises. Everything is going to be okay." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison entered the private consultation room where Michael had been waiting, her face carrying the weight of news no parent should ever hear. She was in her mid-40s, experienced enough to have delivered countless difficult diagnoses, but the compassion in her eyes suggested she never grew numb to it. She sat across from Michael, her hands folded on the desk between them, and spoke with careful gentleness. "Mr. Carter, the tests have given us answers, but I am afraid they are not the answers we hoped for. Tommy has a condition called chronic progressive neurological degeneration. It is extremely rare, genetic, and without treatment, it is fatal." Michael's face remained still, but his knuckles whitened as his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "How long?" he asked, and his voice emerged steady despite the screaming chaos inside his skull. Dr. Morrison's eyes softened with sympathy. 6 months, perhaps less. The disease attacks the nervous system progressively, and once symptoms appear, it moves quickly. Michael closed his eyes for just a moment, seeing Sarah's face, hearing her voice making him promise to protect their son, to keep him safe. He had failed. But Dr. Morrison continued, and her tone shifted toward something that resembled hope. "There is a treatment, Mr. Carter. A drug called Neuragen, developed about 12 years ago specifically for this condition. The success rate is 95%. With proper treatment, Tommy can live a full, normal life." The name hit Michael like a physical blow. Neuragen, his creation, his breakthrough, his sacrifice. His face flickered with recognition for just a fraction of a second before he controlled it, smoothed it away behind a mask of careful neutrality. "Tell me about the treatment protocol," he said quietly. Dr. Morrison explained the regimen, the timeline, the monitoring requirements. Michael nodded, asked technical questions about dosing schedules and potential complications, questions that revealed more medical knowledge than a janitor should possess. He kept his composure even as his world collapsed inward, even as the cosmic cruelty of the situation threatened to tear him apart. His son could be saved by the very drug Michael had brought into existence. The drug he had sacrificed everything to create. All they needed was access to it. Mrs. Chen from the hospital billing department met with Michael the following morning, her desk neat and organized, a computer screen glowing between them like an oracle delivering fate. She was a woman in her 50s who had clearly delivered difficult financial news many times before, and her face held professional sympathy, tempered by years of unmovable hospital policy. She pulled up Tommy's treatment plan on her screen and turned the monitor so Michael could see the numbers. "The full course of Neuragen treatment will cost $280,000, she said gently, as though softening her voice might somehow soften the blow. "This includes the medication itself, administration, monitoring, and follow-up care over the 18-month protocol." Michael stared at the number. $280,000. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and clinical, making everything feel surreal. He had $3,000 in his savings account, money he had been setting aside for Tommy's future, for college someday, for emergencies. This was an emergency beyond anything he had imagined. "What about insurance?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Mrs. Chen shook her head with genuine regret. Your employer's insurance plan has a maximum coverage of $50,000 for specialty medications, and Neuragen is not on their formulary. You would be responsible for the remainder. Michael's hands lay flat on the desk, steady despite the earthquake happening inside him. Payment plans, he said. Charity programs. Financial assistance. Anything. Mrs. Chen walked him through every option with patience and kindness. Payment plans required a 30% deposit he did not have. Charity programs had waiting lists 6 months long, and Tommy did not have 6 months. Financial assistance required income thresholds he barely missed because he worked 3 jobs to support his son. Every door closed before he could reach it. The number remained unchanged, immovable as a mountain. $280,000. Mrs. Chen's voice grew quieter. I need you to understand the timeline, Mr. Carter. Tommy needs his first dose within 2 weeks, or the disease will progress beyond the treatment window. After that point, Neuragen cannot help him. Michael nodded slowly, his composure still intact, his face revealing nothing of the absolute devastation churning inside him. 2 weeks to find money he would never have. 2 weeks to save his son's life. 15 years ago, Michael Carter was 23 years old and believed he could change the world. The laboratory at Cambridge University became his second home, or perhaps his first, because he spent more hours there than in his small student flat near the river. He worked through nights that bled into mornings, his eyes burning from staring at microscope slides and computer models, his mind racing through molecular structures and biochemical pathways with a kind of obsessive focus that separated exceptional scientists from merely good ones. His doctoral thesis focused on neurodegenerative diseases, specifically the rare genetic conditions that destroyed nervous systems with cruel efficiency, and every page he wrote was dedicated to a promise he had made 8 years earlier. Dr. Harold Vance, his mentor, would find Michael in the laboratory at 3 in the morning, still running experiments, still chasing answers. "You are going to burn out," Harold would say, but his voice held admiration rather than criticism, because he recognized something rare in this young man. Michael had the kind of brilliant, intuitive understanding of biochemistry that could not be taught, only nurtured. He saw connections others missed, asked questions others never thought to ask, approached problems from angles that seemed impossible until they worked. Michael's motivation was carved into his soul. When he was 15, his younger sister Emma died from a neurodegenerative disease that had no cure, no treatment, no hope. He had sat beside her hospital bed and watched her decline, watched her bright spirit fade behind the fog of a failing nervous system, watched his parents crumble under the weight of helplessness. In her final days, Emma had squeezed his hand with what little strength remained and made him promise something. "Find the cure, Mikey," she had whispered. "So other families do not have to feel like this," Michael had promised. That promise became his purpose, his driving force, the fire that kept him working when exhaustion tried to claim him. He would find the cure Emma never received. He would honor her memory by saving others. Every experiment, every late night, every breakthrough brought him closer to keeping that sacred promise. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, rain drumming against the laboratory windows while Michael stared at a molecular structure on his computer screen that should not work. The compound synthesis he had designed violated conventional wisdom about how these molecules should behave, but something in his intuition insisted he try it anyway. He synthesized the compound with trembling hands, his heart racing with possibility, and applied it to cellular cultures infected with the neurodegenerative pathology he had been studying. What happened next defied everything he expected. The diseased cells began to repair themselves, the damaged neural pathways reconstructed. The compound was not just slowing the disease, it was reversing it. Michael's hands shook so violently he had to grip the edge of the lab bench to steady himself. This was it. This was the answer. He spent the next 6 weeks in a fever dream of verification, running the same tests again and again, changing variables, eliminating every possible source of error, triple-checking every result, because the implications were too enormous to risk mistake. Every test confirmed the same miraculous truth. The compound worked. He had found the cure Emma never received. Doctor. Vance arrived one morning to find Michael asleep at his desk, surrounded by printouts of successful test results. And when Michael woke and showed him the data, Harold's face transformed with wonder. "My boy, you have done something extraordinary," he whispered. "This will save thousands of lives." They published the academic paper in record time, co-authored by Michael and Harold. And the response from the scientific community was immediate and overwhelming. This was breakthrough research, the kind that appeared once in a generation. Within weeks, pharmaceutical companies began reaching out, each one promising resources and partnerships to bring Michael's discovery to the world. Novacure Pharmaceuticals stood out among them, an industry giant with the infrastructure and capital to fast-track clinical trials and regulatory approval. Their representatives were charming, enthusiastic, speaking Michael's language about changing the world and honoring the patients who suffered. Michael, still young and idealistic, saw only the path to keeping his promise to Emma. He never saw the trap closing around him until it was far too late. Novacure's executives treated Michael like royalty in those early months. They flew him to their headquarters in Boston, put him up in luxury hotels, took him to expensive restaurants where they raised glasses to partnership and progress. They spoke about bringing his cure to millions of suffering patients, about honoring his vision, about changing the landscape of medicine together. Michael sat across from men in expensive suits who smiled warmly and promised him everything a young scientist could dream of. He signed agreements during those meetings, contracts filled with legal language he did not fully understand but trusted because these men spoke about shared goals and mutual respect. They called it partnership. They called it collaboration. They promised his name would be forever linked to the cure that would save countless lives. Novacure fast-tracked his research with impressive speed, bringing in their own scientists to assist with clinical trials and regulatory processes. But gradually, subtly, Michael found himself pushed to the periphery. His research needed refinement, they said. Their team had more experience with pharmaceutical development. He was reassigned to smaller projects, advisory roles, positions that kept him busy but removed from the core work. His name disappeared from research papers. When trial results were published, it was Novacure's scientists listed as lead researchers. Their methodology presented as novel when it was built entirely on Michael's foundation. When Michael protested, when he demanded to know why he was being excluded from his own discovery, they invited him into a conference room and placed the contracts before him. Everything was there in black and white, legal language that translated to a simple truth. Novacure owned the research, owned the patents, owned the compound itself. Michael had signed away every right, every claim, every piece of intellectual property in exchange for promises that meant nothing. He was an employee, nothing more, and they could assign him wherever they wished. Dr. Vance tried to help, tried to advocate for his brilliant student, but Novacure funded Cambridge's entire biochemistry department. Harold's hands were tied. "I am so sorry, Michael," he said, genuine anguish in his voice. "They have done this to others before. I should have warned you." Michael stood alone, watching his creation slip through his fingers, powerless to stop it. Michael faced an impossible choice in those dark weeks after the betrayal became clear. He could fight, hire lawyers, challenge the contracts, tie Novacure up in litigation that might last years. But every day spent in legal battles was another day the cure remained unavailable to dying patients. People like Emma, people suffering without hope, would continue to die while lawyers argued over who deserved credit and profit. The drug worked. It could save lives right now. Could Michael's ego justify that delay? He met Sarah during this crisis, a nurse at a London hospital specializing in neurological care. She had kind eyes and gentle hands, and she told him about a patient, a young mother of 28 dying from the same disease Michael's cure could stop. The woman had a 2-year-old daughter who visited every day, who did not understand why Mummy could not hold her anymore. "Would you like to meet her?" Sarah asked quietly, and Michael said yes. He sat beside that young mother's bed, watched her struggle to speak, saw the fear in her eyes when she looked at her daughter playing with blocks in the corner. That little girl would grow up without her mother. And Michael's cure sat in a laboratory, ready to help, waiting only for regulatory approval that Novacure could push through faster than anyone else. That night, Michael made his choice. He returned to Novacure and signed a full release, surrendering every remaining claim, every potential future right, everything. He took nothing. He walked away completely, freeing the drug from any possible legal complication that his presence might create. Sarah understood what he had done, understood the magnitude of the sacrifice. She saw his character in that choice, saw the man who valued other people's lives above his own recognition. She fell in love not with a brilliant scientist, but with a human being who chose compassion over pride. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony with few guests. Sarah was 3 months pregnant when Novacure launched Neuragen to international acclaim. Press conferences celebrating their breakthrough, stock prices soaring, executives taking credit for saving thousands of lives. Michael's name appeared nowhere in their materials. He watched the launch on television, Sarah beside him, her hand on her growing belly, and felt only peace. People would live. That was enough. The years that followed were not wealthy, but they were rich in ways that mattered. Michael and Sarah lived in a small flat, scraped by on her nursing salary and his income from odd jobs, and loved each other with the kind of depth that made poverty irrelevant. Tommy arrived on a spring morning, perfect and small and screaming with life, and Sarah held him for 6 beautiful hours before the complications began. The hemorrhaging started suddenly, catastrophically. Michael stood beside her bed, holding her hand as machines beeped urgent warnings and doctors rushed to save her. Sarah looked at Michael with love and exhaustion and made him promise one final thing. "Take care of our son," she whispered. "Give him everything," Michael promised, and she smiled, and then she was gone. The grief nearly destroyed him, but Tommy needed a father, and Michael had made a promise. He transformed himself into exactly what his son needed. His doctoral degree went unused, gathering dust in a box beneath their bed, because research positions required long hours and unpredictable schedules. Michael took manual labor jobs instead, working as a janitor, a warehouse loader, a night shift cleaner, positions that paid poorly but allowed him flexibility to be present for Tommy's childhood. He was there for first steps and first words. He read bedtime stories every night, his voice steady and warm. He answered endless questions about science and stars and how things worked. He packed lunches with notes tucked inside. He attended every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered. 7 years of sacrifice that never felt like sacrifice because Tommy was everything. They lived modestly in their cramped apartment, ate simple meals, wore second-hand clothes. But Tommy grew up surrounded by love and curiosity and a father who gave up the world to be present. Michael occasionally saw advertisements for Neuragen on television, saw Novacure's executives celebrating their success, saw the lives being saved by his creation. He never regretted his choice. People were living because of what he had discovered and released. That was enough. It was always enough. Until the morning Tommy collapsed at school and Michael learned his son needed the very drug he had created. The drug now hidden behind a price he could never pay. Only then did regret begin to whisper in the dark corners of his heart. Michael became a man possessed by singular purpose. He took a second job in construction, hauling materials and mixing concrete during daylight hours, his muscles screaming from labor his body was not built for. Then he added a third job, weekend shifts at a warehouse loading trucks, his hands developing blisters that burst and bled and formed calluses thick as leather. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in fragments, surviving on coffee and determination. His body began to betray him, shedding weight he could not afford to lose, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that grew gaunt and hollow. He was 40 pounds lighter within a month, his face carved with exhaustion, his eyes sunken but burning with desperate hope. He sold everything that held value, Sarah's jewelry, the wedding ring he had kept in a box by his bedside, the delicate necklace she wore on their wedding day. A collector paid him $8,000 for his doctoral diploma and his research awards, framed certificates that represented a life abandoned. He sold their furniture piece by piece, their small television, their kitchen table, until their apartment was nearly empty. He had already sold the car months ago. He moved them to an even cheaper apartment across town, a single room with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked through the night, saving $300 monthly that went straight into the fund for Tommy's medicine. Michael created a crowdfunding campaign, writing Tommy's story with shaking hands, posting it across social media platforms, begging strangers for help. The response was beautiful and heartbreaking. $12,000 arrived in small donations, $5 here, $20 there, people giving what little they could. But $12,000 was nowhere near $280,000. Time was running out. Tommy's symptoms worsened daily, his coordination deteriorating, his headaches intensifying, his bright curiosity dimming behind a fog of illness. Michael watched his son fade and worked harder, slept less, pushed his body beyond its limits. He was breaking apart, held together only by love and desperation. But mathematics were merciless. No amount of sacrifice could bridge the gap between what he had and what Tommy needed. Michael had given everything, and everything was not enough. Michael returned to the hospital exactly 2 weeks after the diagnosis, the deadline Mrs. Chen had given him burned into his memory. Tommy needed the first dose today, or the treatment window would close forever. Michael carried a folder containing bank statements, receipts from everything he had sold, documentation of the crowdfunding campaign. He had $48,000. He had worked himself to collapse, sold everything he owned, begged strangers for help, and he had $48,000. It was not enough. It would never be enough. Mrs. Chen looked at the papers spread across her desk, looked at Michael's gaunt face and trembling hands, and her professional composure cracked. "Mr. Carter, I am so sorry," she said, and her voice was thick with genuine anguish. "Hospital policy requires payment arrangements that cover at least 80% of the total cost. You have raised an extraordinary amount, but it is not sufficient for us to begin treatment." Michael stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, this dignified man who had survived betrayal and loss and years of sacrifice got down on his knees in her office. The movement was not dramatic or theatrical. It was the action of a father who had nothing left to give except his pride, and his son's life was worth more than pride. "Please," Michael said, and his voice broke completely. "I will work for it. I will clean your hospital for free. For years. However long it takes. I will scrub floors and empty trash and do whatever you need. Please. He is 7 years old. He is all I have." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Carter, please get up," she whispered. But Michael stayed on his knees, his hands clasped before him like prayer. His voice dissolved into sobs. "Please," he repeated. "Please. He is just a little boy. He deserves to live. I am begging you, please." Mrs. Chen was crying openly now. But she shook her head because policy was policy. Because the hospital system was merciless, even when individuals were kind. Michael collapsed forward, his hands covering his face, his body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they seemed to tear him apart. Outside the office window, Rachel Martinez, a senior nurse passing by, stopped and witnessed the scene. She stood frozen, watching this broken man weep on the floor, and felt her heart shatter for a stranger. Rachel Martinez could not shake the image of Michael Carter on his knees, could not unhear the sound of his desperate sobbing. It could not forget the raw anguish of a father watching his child die while holding money that was simultaneously everything and nothing. She had been a nurse for 22 years, had witnessed suffering in countless forms, but something about this particular tragedy burrowed into her heart and would not let go. That evening, she volunteered to sit with Tommy while Michael disappeared into another office to fill out more financial aid applications that would likely lead nowhere. Tommy was pale and tired, his small body seeming to sink into the hospital bed. But his eyes still held brightness when he talked about his father. "My dad is really smart," Tommy told her, his voice weak but proud. "He knows everything about science. He used to work at a really important lab before I was born, doing big experiments and stuff." Rachel smiled and asked gentle questions, keeping Tommy's mind occupied, away from the fear. Tommy talked about how his dad kept old papers in a box under their bed, research stuff with lots of big words and diagrams. "My dad invented something once," Tommy said. "Something important. He does not talk about it much, but I saw the papers once. They had his name on them." Something about Tommy's words tugged at Rachel's mind, a thread that seemed important, though she could not say why. That night, lying in bed, Rachel could not sleep. Her mind kept circling back to Tommy's casual mention of his father's research background, the important lab, the invention. Michael Carter did not carry himself like a janitor. His questions to Dr. Morrison had been too precise, too technical. His understanding of Neuragen's treatment protocol had been too detailed. Curiosity drove Rachel from bed to her laptop in the early morning hours. She started researching Neuragen's history, initially just wanting to understand whether the astronomical cost was justified, whether there was any reasonable explanation for why a life-saving drug should be priced beyond the reach of ordinary people. What she found in those first searches was standard pharmaceutical company marketing, but something nagged at her, so she kept digging, searching for the drug's origins, its development history, the scientists behind its creation. She was looking for something without knowing what, following an instinct that whispered there was more to this story than anyone realized. Rachel's initial search for Neuragen's development history led her to academic journals, and there, buried in papers from 15 years ago, she found a name that made her breath catch: Michael Carter, lead researcher on preliminary studies of neurodegenerative pathway inhibition. She clicked through to his doctoral thesis, publicly available through Cambridge's archives, and read the abstract of groundbreaking work on the exact mechanisms that Neuragen targeted. The foundational science was his. Rachel's heart began to race as she traced the timeline. Michael's breakthrough paper published in a prestigious journal. Then, 6 months later, NovaCure's announcement of a promising new compound in development. Then, nothing. Michael Carter's name disappeared from publications entirely. No follow-up research, no papers, nothing. Meanwhile, NovaCure's patent applications filled the gap, claiming the compound synthesis, the treatment protocols, everything Michael had pioneered. She searched deeper, following threads through academic databases and research forums. On an obscure medical ethics discussion board, she found a post from 7 years ago, a former Cambridge researcher commenting on pharmaceutical industry practices. The username was deleted, but the post remained. Does anyone remember the scandal of what NovaCure did to Carter? That brilliant kid who invented their blockbuster neurological drug? They took everything from him and erased his name from history. Corporate theft, dressed up as legal contracts. Rachel's hands shook as pieces connected in her mind. She searched Michael Carter's full name alongside NovaCure Pharmaceuticals and found almost nothing, as though someone had systematically scrubbed the connection from the internet. But the internet never truly forgets. She found an archived news article from a university publication, a feature on young researchers to watch. There, dated 16 years ago, was a photograph that made Rachel's chest tighten. Michael Carter, 22 years old, standing in a laboratory, holding a molecular model, his face bright with hope and determination. The caption read, "Doctoral candidate Michael Carter with his revolutionary approach to treating neurodegenerative diseases. Colleagues predict his work will transform the field." Rachel stared at that photograph, at the young man who would become the exhausted father begging on his knees, and understood the full, terrible irony. Michael Carter had invented Neuragen. The drug that could save his son's life was his own creation, stolen from him and sold back at a price designed to be impossible. Rachel found Dr. Morrison in her office the next morning, closing the door carefully behind her before spreading printouts across the desk. "I need you to look at something," Rachel said quietly. "It is about Tommy Carter's father, Dr." Morrison glanced up with polite skepticism. But as Rachel walked her through the timeline, the academic papers, the photographs, The sudden disappearance of Michael's name from scientific literature, skepticism transformed into something else. "This cannot be right," Dr. Morrison murmured, but her voice held uncertainty rather than conviction. They searched together for Dr. Harold Vance, Michael's former mentor, finding his email address listed in an old Cambridge faculty directory marked retired. Dr. Morrison composed a careful message explaining the situation, asking if he remembered Michael Carter and could provide any information about his work on neurodegenerative diseases. The reply arrived within an hour, and its contents made both women sit back in their chairs, stunned. Dr. Vance's email was long, detailed, and vibrating with barely contained anger. He recounted everything. Michael's brilliant breakthrough at 23, NovaCure's predatory contracts that a naive young scientist signed in good faith, the systematic erasure of Michael's contributions, the way they pushed him out of his own research, and then the part that made Rachel's eyes sting with tears. Dr. Vance described Michael's impossible choice. He could have fought them, Dr. Vance wrote. He could have tied the drug up in legal battles for years, but Michael knew that every day of delay meant more people dying. So he walked away. He signed away everything, took nothing, sacrificed his entire future so that Neuragen could reach patients without complication. Michael Carter is the real creator of Neuragen. He gave up his career, his recognition, his financial security, so it could save lives. The irony that it might not save his own son is unbearable. It is a cosmic injustice that breaks my heart. Rachel and Dr. Morrison sat in stunned silence after reading the email. They spent the next 2 hours verifying every detail through old patents, research papers, academic records, conference proceedings. Every piece of evidence confirmed the same truth. Michael Carter had invented the drug. He had sacrificed everything to bring it to the world. And now that world was letting his son die because he could not afford to buy back his own creation. Dr. Morrison walked directly to the office of James Thornton, the hospital administrator, carrying the full documentation of what she and Rachel had uncovered. James was a practical man in his 60s who had spent his career navigating healthcare bureaucracy. But as Elizabeth laid out Michael Carter's story, his face transformed from professional attention to genuine outrage. "This is unconscionable," he said quietly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "Authorize Tommy's treatment immediately under our charity care program. The hospital will absorb the full cost." But Dr. Morrison shook her head. "James, that helps Tommy, and thank God for it. But this is not just about one case. This is about systemic injustice. A man invented a life-saving drug and was robbed of any benefit from his creation. Now, pharmaceutical companies price these medications beyond the reach of ordinary people while making billions in profit. This story needs to be told." Rachel Martinez, who had been standing quietly by the door, spoke up with passion, sharpening her voice. "I want to share this," she said. "With your permission, the world needs to know." With Dr. Morrison and James Thornton's careful approval, Rachel crafted a social media post that evening, meticulously fact-checked, every claim supported by documentation. She titled it, "The Man Who Invented the Medicine Cannot Afford to Save His Son," and told Michael's story in clear, compelling terms. She posted it across multiple platforms and waited. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 50 shares in the first hour, then 500, then 5,000. The algorithm caught fire, pushing the story to wider audiences, each share carrying righteous anger and heartbreak. Local news stations picked it up by midday, sending reporters to the hospital. By evening, national news networks were running segments. Michael's old photograph from Cambridge displayed beside images of NovaCure's gleaming headquarters. NovaCure's stock price dropped 3% in after-hours trading. The hashtag Justice for Michael began trending, spreading across the country and then globally. Thousands of people shared their own stories of medication prices, of pharmaceutical industry greed, of loved ones who died because treatment was unaffordable. Media trucks descended on St. Catherine's Hospital, satellite dishes raised toward the sky, reporters clamoring for interviews. The story had exploded beyond anything Rachel imagined. A single father's tragedy transforming into a rallying cry against systemic injustice. Novacure Pharmaceuticals entered full crisis mode as the story metastasized across every media platform. Richard Blackwood, the company's 55-year-old CEO, stood in the executive conference room watching their carefully constructed public image crumble in real time on a bank of television screens. News anchors discussed pharmaceutical greed. Social media exploded with rage. Protesters gathered outside their Boston headquarters, holding signs that read, "Carter's Cure, Carter's Son," and "Profit over People." The pressure came from every direction simultaneously. Doctors across the country threatened to boycott Neuragen despite its effectiveness, stating they could not in good conscience prescribe a drug built on such exploitation. Congressional representatives issued statements calling for investigations into pharmaceutical pricing practices and researcher exploitation. Medical ethics boards demanded inquiries. The board of directors held emergency meetings, their voices sharp with panic as they watched stock prices fluctuate and brand value evaporate. Richard initially fell back on the standard corporate playbook he had perfected over decades. Deny any wrongdoing. Deflect attention to the complexities of drug development costs. Issue carefully worded statements about respecting proprietary information. Perhaps hint at legal action against those spreading the story. His public relations team drafted responses filled with corporate language that said nothing while sounding official. But then his daughter Emma arrived at his office, 23 years old, idealistic. Everything Richard had been before wealth and power slowly corroded the parts of him that used to care about things beyond profit margins. She had seen the news coverage. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice carrying disappointment that cut deeper than any board member's criticism. "Is this who we are? Is this what you built?" Richard wanted to explain about business realities, about fiduciary duties to shareholders, about how the world worked. But Emma pulled up the news footage on her phone, showing Michael Carter's face, broken and desperate, begging for his son's life. She turned the screen toward her father. "Look at him," she said. "Really, look." Richard looked. He saw a man roughly his own age, worn down by sacrifice and loss. He saw desperation and dignity coexisting in the same exhausted face. And suddenly, Richard saw himself 30 years ago, fresh out of business school, still believing that medicine should serve people rather than profit. He remembered the person he had been before corner offices, and stock options transformed his values into something unrecognizable. Richard Blackwood called an unscheduled press conference that afternoon. Standing before a podium flanked by cameras and reporters who expected the usual corporate deflection, instead, he delivered something that stunned the watching world. "I am here to acknowledge a profound injustice," Richard began, his voice steady but lacking its usual corporate polish. 15 years ago, Novacure Pharmaceuticals failed a young scientist named Michael Carter. He created the foundation for what became Neuragen, a drug that has saved thousands of lives. We exploited his trust, used legal contracts to strip him of credit and compensation, and erased his contributions from our history. The room erupted with questions, but Richard continued. "Effective immediately, Tommy Carter will receive full treatment for his condition, funded entirely by Novacure, with our deepest apologies to his father. But this cannot be only about one case, however important. Today, I am announcing the Carter Initiative, a comprehensive program with 2 pillars. First, we will ensure that researchers and scientists who contribute to our drugs are fairly compensated and properly credited. Second, we are establishing a fund to provide Neuragen at no cost to any patient who cannot afford it. No one should die because they lack money for medicine that could save them." Richard paused, seeming to gather himself. "Additionally, I am offering Michael Carter the position of Chief Research Officer at Novacure, with full public recognition as the creator of Neuragen and complete authority over research ethics and scientist compensation." The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. Some called it genuine contrition, a CEO finding his conscience. Others labeled it damage control, a calculated move to salvage the company's reputation and stock price. Medical ethicists debated the sincerity. Business analysts discussed the financial implications, but none of it mattered to Michael Carter, who learned about the announcement while sitting beside Tommy's hospital bed, holding his son's hand. A nurse brought him a tablet showing the live press conference. Michael watched in silence, tears streaming down his face as the impossible became possible. Tommy would live. Other families would not face the same nightmare. His son would survive. That was all that mattered. The hospital room filled with quiet witnesses as Tommy Carter received his first infusion of Neuragen. Michael sat beside the bed, holding his son's small hand in both of his own, and tears streamed down his face in rivers that would not stop. But these tears were different from the ones he had cried on Mrs. Chen's office floor. These were tears of relief so profound it felt like breathing after drowning. Tears of hope that had seemed impossible just days ago. Tears of overwhelming emotion that came from watching the universe bend toward justice after years of cruelty. Rachel Martinez stood behind Michael, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her own eyes wet. Dr. Morrison stood at the foot of the bed, smiling with genuine joy, having fought beside them for this moment. Other nurses who had heard the story gathered quietly in the doorway, bearing witness to something that felt larger than medicine, larger than science. The intravenous line ran from the bag hanging above Tommy's bed, down into his thin arm, and the clear liquid dripped slowly, methodically, each drop containing the compound Michael had synthesized 15 years ago in a Cambridge laboratory. Each drop carried the promise he made to his dying sister. Each drop represented the sacrifice he made walking away from recognition and wealth. Each drop held hope that had traveled through betrayal and loss and years of quiet suffering to arrive at this impossible moment. The medicine Michael brought into the world, the cure he gave freely so others might live, now flowed into his own son's veins, finally serving the purpose he always intended. Tommy looked up at his father with curious eyes, seeing the tears but not understanding their meaning. "Dad, why are you crying?" he asked, his voice still weak but clearer than it had been in days. Michael smiled through his tears, squeezed his son's hand, and answered with perfect truth. "Because miracles are real, buddy," he whispered. "They are real." The IV continued its steady drip, each drop a miracle, each moment a redemption, each breath a testament to love that sacrifices everything and sometimes, just sometimes, receives everything back. The weeks following Tommy's first infusion brought transformation that felt miraculous to everyone who witnessed it. Tommy responded beautifully to Neuragen, his small body accepting the treatment as though it had been waiting for rescue. Color returned to his pale cheeks, blooming like spring after endless winter. His energy surged back in waves, first allowing him to sit up without exhaustion, then to walk the hospital corridors, then to run down those same hallways with laughter echoing off sterile walls. He asked Michael endless questions about the science of his own medicine, about how the molecules worked, about what was happening inside his cells, and for the first time in 7 years, Michael explained in intricate detail. He drew diagrams on napkins, described chemical pathways with the passion that had once driven him through those Cambridge nights. His love of research, dormant for so long, rekindled like embers finding oxygen. Novacure made good on every promise, Richard Blackwood announced. They republished Neuragen's complete patent history with Michael's name prominently featured as the primary inventor. Academic journals ran retrospective pieces celebrating the forgotten father of Neuragen, interviewing former colleagues who remembered his brilliance. Universities across the country extended invitations for speaking engagements, wanting to hear his story, wanting him to inspire the next generation of researchers. But Michael discovered he had no interest in fame. He accepted Novacure's offer to serve as chief research officer, but with one non-negotiable condition. He would work normal hours, 40 hours weekly, no exceptions. He would never again sacrifice time with Tommy for any career, any breakthrough, any achievement. His son had nearly died while Michael worked himself to exhaustion. That would never happen again. Tommy was his priority, always. His first project in his new role focused on developing a more affordable synthesis pathway for Neuragen. working to drive down production costs so the drug could be offered at prices ordinary families could manage. He assembled a team of brilliant researchers, treating them with the respect and fairness he never received, ensuring their names appeared on every paper, their contributions recognized and rewarded. Michael Carter had finally returned to the work he loved. But he returned as a different man. One who understood that the greatest discoveries meant nothing if you lost yourself making them. 6 months later, Tommy Carter ran through Memorial Park on a Saturday afternoon, his legs pumping with energy that seemed boundless, his laughter carrying across the green expanse like music. Michael sat on a bench watching his son, truly at peace for the first time in years. Tommy was in full remission, every test confirming what Michael could see with his own eyes. His son was healthy, vibrant, alive in ways that transcended mere survival. Michael had returned to meaningful research, working in laboratories where his contributions were valued and his time was respected. He was properly compensated now, comfortable in ways he had never been. But the money mattered less than the purpose. He was changing lives again, developing treatments, mentoring the next generation. The Carter Initiative had helped 200 families afford Neuragen in its first 6 months. 200 children who would live because Michael had fought not just for his son but for systemic change. He mentored young researchers with particular care, teaching them to value their worth, to protect their discoveries, to never let corporations exploit their idealism. He told them his story as a warning and an inspiration. Rachel Martinez had become family, joining them for weekly dinners where they laughed and shared stories and built the kind of bonds that transcended blood. She was Tommy's honorary aunt, Michael's trusted friend, the woman whose curiosity and courage had saved them both. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Tommy climbed onto the bench beside his father, still breathing hard from running, his cheeks flushed with health and happiness. "Dad, are we rich now?" he asked, with the innocent directness of childhood. Michael looked at his son, at the boy who had nearly been taken from him, and thought about the years of poverty they had endured. He thought about selling Sarah's wedding ring, about begging on his knees, about the pain that had nearly destroyed him. He thought about the fathers and mothers who no longer faced that same nightmare because the Carter Initiative gave them hope. He thought about Tommy's laughter, about bedtime stories and answered questions, about sacrifices that had somehow, impossibly, led to redemption. Michael pulled Tommy close, wrapping his arm around his son's shoulders, and smiled. "Yes, buddy," he said softly. "We always were." The sun set behind them, painting the sky in golds and purples. Their silhouettes merged together as father and son, and Tommy's laughter carried on the wind, the sound of a miracle, of justice, of love that sacrifices everything, and sometimes, just sometimes, receives everything back.